Well, good morning. You survived the snowpocalypse. You're here. I'm glad you're here. For those of you tuning online, hopefully you're snuggled up with a blanket and watching from home. I'm grateful to be with you this morning. And one of my philosophies on preaching is that I believe in the power of preaching from the whole counsel of Scripture, which sometimes means you run into stories like this, which I just kind of think it's funny that after reading that, Wayne has to say, this is the word of the Lord. It is a bit of a challenging text. It's a graphic text. It's one you're like, do we really need to talk about this in church? But I really think that there's power when we don't buy into the temptation to want to skip over difficult texts, but really lean into them because there's something happening here. And I think this text, when we read it carefully, we understand that actually this isn't so much a tragedy about John's life. It is a tragedy, indeed, a tragedy. But the real tragic character in this story is Herod. And when we read this and understand that, it really frames, I think, how we can ask some real hard questions of ourselves. And so, in order to understand what's happening, there are so many names, it can be a little bit confusing. So I made a chart for us to try to give us a little bit of context to understand the story. And part of the challenge is there are a lot of Herods in Scripture. So when you see Herod, it may not be the same Herod. But at the very top of this chart, you'll see Herod the Great. And Herod the Great was the Herod that was ruling the time when Jesus was born. He had 4 sons. You'll notice the son on the far right, or the far left, was Aristobulus. And what happened was that there was an argument. Okay, so Aristobulus and Herod had this major argument. They did not agree on something. And so Herod was ruthless and he killed him. And so because of that, right before he was killed, he had a daughter, and her name was Herodias. And she ends up falling in love with Philip, who's her uncle. They get married, and then you have Herod Antipas, okay, right? Now that's the Herod from our story. So if you're still with me, Herod Antipas, at that point, falls in love with Herodias, which, yes, if you're following, that's his niece, also his sister-in-law, which is really confusing, and then seduces her and marries her. Now, if you think your family's messed up, it's probably not this bad, okay? This is a pretty messed up thing. And what I want you to understand is it's not as if like this was normal in this time period. This was abnormal. In fact, people were enraged by Herod's behavior. It was not okay. We went against the law of Moses. People were not like cheering him on. In fact, there was a lot of frustration. But what we'll find out is there was one person who was willing to speak truth to power. And that one person was John the Baptist. And so it may be easy to read this story and think, oh man, what tragic end for John the Baptist. And well, yes, I would actually argue that this is a triumphant story of John the Baptist, that his life was given for the sake of his cause. And the real tragedy here is the man and character of Herod. And so with that, I would ask you to think about this story through the lens of, we need to learn from Herod's downfall. What led to it? What caused it? And we're going to identify 3 things in the story that I think are going to really help us. First thing that we're going to look at is this idea of doubt. Because Herod, in his sort of processing everything, is wrestling with these doubts. And so what do doubts do to us? Verse 20, it's a fascinating little verse. It says, because Herod feared John and protected him, knowing him to be a righteous and holy man. When Herod heard John, he was greatly puzzled, and yet he liked to listen to him. And so understanding a little context, the Herods of the Herodian dynasty, they sort of ruled over, the colonial rulers over Judea and Galilee under this imperial Rome. And one of the things that colonial rulers aren't supposed to do is offend the moral sensibilities of their people. You don't trample on their moral sensibilities. That's a no-no. And so that's exactly what happens when Herod Antipas ends up marrying Herodias, because it totally went against the cultural norms, and it was very inappropriate. And it outraged people. It made people mad and upset. He was a very self-indulgent and very prideful king. Then you have John the Baptist, who was willing to speak about his sin, who was willing to call him out for the kind of man that he was. But there was a challenge. Herodias finds out about this, and so she doesn't want, she wants John the Baptist dead. Right? So the Bible says she has a grudge against him. She wants him out of the picture, but there's a problem. Herod has this crazy fascination with John. It says in verse 20, Herod was fascinated with John. And notice, after he's in prison, it says, Herod heard John. He loved to hear him, but he was greatly puzzled, even though he loved to hear him. Now, here's what's so funny about the story. So here you have John the Baptist, who's not afraid to call him out for his bad behavior. But Herod loved to hear him preach, was obsessed with his preaching, that he would take him out of prison just to hear him share and teach. Because for some reason, Herod just could not help but be compelled by both his preaching and by his character. I understand this about John the Baptist, is that he was a very popular person in this time period. So much so that when he would go to preach, thousands of people would gather to come and hear him. And in fact, there's this one story, you can read about it in the Gospels, where John is preaching and thousands of people are coming, but Jesus is supposed to be preaching across the river. And so what does John do? He says, hey, I know you're all here to see me, like you think I'm your guy, but the only reason I'm here is to point to that guy. And now that guy's here. And so you should leave me and go over and listen to him. And everyone's like, no, John, we're here for you. But again and again, John in his preaching was always pointing to the one who was to come, who was Jesus. And so you have this, in fact, in Matthew 11, there's this moment when Jesus says, truly I say to you, among those born of women, there has arisen no man greater than John the Baptist. And so Jesus, in his own words, is like, John's the real deal. Like, he believes what he's preaching. Listen to him. There's no one quite like John. And so you think about that. Why in the world would Herod then bring this man out of prison to preach when that man is denouncing your marriage in front of everybody? Why would he do this again and again? And the answer is, on one hand, Herod liked John. Something about John was compelled by him. And on the other hand, he repulsed him. That word puzzled in the Greek carries this idea of a double mind, right? Double psyche. In the Greek, the word that it's probably best represented, because our English translation doesn't quite do it justice. The word is dipsakakis, which you're going to read about that in James 1. Remember, there's that passage in James 1 where James is like, you are double-minded in all you do. You are tossed in the sea because of your doubt. That word for doubt is this word. These two things at war with each other. A double mind. And it reminds us of something. I was trying to think of a metaphor for this. It's kind of like we have a treadmill in our basement. You know, it's with the weather like it is. Getting out to walk is a little more challenging these days. And my wife and I will sometimes do these competitions, you know, who can get more time on the treadmill. And she's here, so I have to confess this in front of her now. But sometimes when I'm on the treadmill and I want to go get a drink of water, I'll leave it running, you know. Give me a few extra steps in my mileage. And I'll go get a drink of water. I'll come back. But it's that feeling of stepping onto the treadmill while it's moving. You know what I'm talking about? Where like for a moment you lose your balance and you don't know whether you're going to fall or make it, and you kind of grab the rails. Or like when you're in the airport and you're walking on one of those moving floors, you know what I'm talking about? And you step off, or an escalator, you step off and all of a sudden you kind of lose your balance for a second. It's that space in between where you feel like you're going to fall, but you're trying to regain your balance. It's in that space where we see this idea of doubt, where we're questioning what we believe. And Herod is in that little middle space. For a moment, you're not really on the treadmill or off it. You're somewhere in between. And this is what's going on with Herod. It's like vertigo. He's dizzy. He's not really understanding. He doesn't sure what he believes. And he's got to make a decision. And I think for many of us, spiritual vertigo, right? This sort of feeling of, am I actually believing this? Do I not believe this? Is something all of us can experience both inside and outside the Christian faith. And so let me give you just an example of this. Mark 9 does a remarkable job of kind of painting this picture. We'll actually preach on this in a few weeks. But for now, let me just give you a snapshot. There's a father with his son. His son is having convulsions, and he comes to Jesus and says, would you please heal my son? And Jesus says, I can if you believe. And the man says, I believe, but help my unbelief. And there's such a power in that statement, right? He is saying, I do believe, but I'm so filled with doubts I do believe, but at the same time, I don't know if I believe. Like he's perched on the edge of a cliff. Like I know, I don't think I'm going to fall. I think you're going to be able to do this, but I don't fully know. You read more about this in Psalm 73, right? There's this psalm where you see this man who believed in God, but because of all the suffering he's endured and the loss he's had in his family, terrible injustice have happened to him. He's experienced all these things, and it drove him to the edge. And he writes, "My feet almost slipped." Like all these things, and I've questioned my belief. Do you actually exist? Are you actually for my good? Are you actually going to deliver me? And there's this honest moment where the psalmist is like, you know what? I almost fell and collapsed, because he acknowledged that reality. For a moment, he lost his assurance in God. That's what I'm talking about, this doubt, the spiritual vertigo, this wavering, the sense that we lose our balance and we're unsure. When you go into this from time to time and you walk through it, what are we supposed to do? When you experience doubt, when you see things that are happening in our world, or maybe something that's happened to you, and you say, why would God allow something like that to happen to me or to this person? And you have that moment of doubt. Have you ever experienced that? That question that raises? I would argue that there are three things we're supposed to do when we experience that, and that's what we're going to see here in the text. And the first thing you should do when you have that is to see it positively, because it's actually a window of opportunity. We have to see it positively. I think the whole point of this passage is to show that Herod had a window of opportunity, a moment where he could have changed his life and actually believed the things that John was saying. And he let that possibility, that window, go by. I think the whole point, and we'll talk about the why later, is that if you know anything about Herods and just the history of the Herods, is that they were really miserable men, right? Because they were power hungry, because they would do anything to gain power, meaning they would harm other people, they would take advantage of those who were on the margin, they would do all kinds of things to sort of elevate themselves above everyone else. And he has this moment of opportunity where he could look at his life and say, you know what, there is a different and better way. I see something in John, but he lets that opportunity pass him by. Herod is struggling with doubts. He's being confronted with his own life. And doubt was an opportunity, that sort of dissonance inside of him, an opportunity to change, an opportunity to go a different direction. And I think this is really important. And here's why I think this is important. I think sometimes doubt in religious spaces can be a negative thing, where we say we shouldn't talk about doubt. It's a bad word. It'll lead to deconstruction and losing your faith, and we should run away from it because it's a bad thing. And people will talk about it in these really negative terms. And I think that's because religion, when we get hyper-religious, right, our religion becomes, if I obey and I follow this subset of rules, then somehow I'm going to put God in my debt, and he is going to one day bless me for the way in which I behave, right? Christianity operates on a totally different paradigm. The gospel says, no, actually, you're accepted because of the work of Jesus, not anything you've done, but because what Christ has done on your behalf. And therefore, out of your love and devotion for God, you're gonna walk in the way he's called you to walk. That's very different, right, than the religious who say, hey, you need to do A, B, C, and D in order to make your way into heaven. And so because of the dogmatic reality of the hyper-religious, here's what happens, right? Psychological certainty becomes an idol. We have to be so incredibly certain about all things and have all the answers at all times that if you even put a hint of doubt, everything else will come crumbling down. But the scriptures talk so differently about doubt. I'll give you a couple examples of that. The Bible looks at faith and doubt differently. Jude 22 says, be merciful to those who doubt. Show mercy to those who doubt. That's a command for us to be merciful to those who doubt. Even more poignantly in Mark 9, right? The Father says, heal my son. And Jesus says, I can if you believe. And when the man responds, I believe, but I'm struggling. I'm not 100% there. I'm maybe 40% there, God. And then what happens? Jesus doesn't go, hey, all right, go figure it out, right? Muster up enough faith. And once you can get there 100%, then come back and maybe I'll consider healing your son. That's not his response at all. Jesus shows mercy and he heals the man's son. So what does that mean? It means, and I want you to picture this metaphor. If you're on a cliff, in fact, just last night I was watching that live Netflix, Alex Honnold climb the skyscraper. Anybody watch that last night? A couple of you? Yeah, it was live. And so it's terrifying because he has a wife and kids and he's climbing a skyscraper free solo. There's no ropes attached to him. There's no net. It's a live television program. He could fall and it would all be over. And so I'm watching this thing. I should go to bed because it's late, but it's getting to the top of this skyscraper. And at any moment, like there's this genuine fear. And I don't know about you, but I have these dreams all the time of falling off cliffs. It's probably because I'm watching stuff like this. But I don't know what it says about, don't psychoanalyze me. But think about this for a second. Imagine you're on a cliff or a skyscraper, whatever. Imagine being on a cliff and you're about to fall. And the only way you can save yourself, the only way you could to survive the fall is if you reach out and you grab the branch that you can see on the side of the mountain. And you know that branch is there, but you're maybe 10% sure that branch will hold your body weight. But even so, it's better than 0%. And so as you're falling, you reach out and you grab that branch and you hold on for dear life. And sure enough, the branch holds because the branch was 100% able to hold your weight, and you find yourself saved. Here's the thing. If you were only 10% sure the branch would hold you, does that mean the branch only 10% saved you? The answer is no. You are 100% saved because the quality of your faith, it's not the quality of your faith in the branch itself that's going to save you, but it's the quality of the branch itself. Are you tracking with me? It's not the quality of our faith that saves us. It's the object of our faith. It is Jesus Christ who is sufficient to save you, not your ability to muster up enough faith, because ultimately salvation is God and God's alone. And so you see religious people who don't understand faith and grace and don't understand that picture, they're going to really struggle. They're going to struggle in this life because for them it's about, can I muster up enough faith? Can I do enough things? But the gospel, the good news for you and I, and the truth of the scriptures and what Jesus again and again and again brings to us is actually, no, it's not about you. It's not about the quality of your faith, but it's actually about the one who can save you. And that's really, really good news. And so we have all this, and you have this Herod being confronted with these things, and you realize that these doubts are actually a wonderful opportunity for him. But the second thing he has to do, besides see it as a window of opportunity, is that realizing what doubts will do is they'll confront the foundations of your life. They'll force you to look at the reality of your life. What is your worldview? How do you see the world? What are the foundations that you live on? And that's what's so good about doubt, is it actually makes you ask questions. Look at Herod. What brought Herod into this episode, right, was this struggling. Verse 20, it says he has fear of John. It said, Herod feared John. You may ask, well, what does it mean that he feared John? He couldn't have been scared of him. He was in chains. Like, he couldn't do anything to Herod. But when the Bible uses terms like this, it means that Herod was filled with this sort of awe and wonder and respect. He saw his integrity. He saw John's courage. He was the only man in the kingdom who was willing to look him in the eye and tell him the truth. And there was something about that captured Herod. And I think it's because John was in the process of changing or attempting to change Herod's foundational view of the world. You see, Herod was a power-hungry person. He exploited people. He trampled on people. He didn't really care about the wreckage he left in behind him. And there are tons of people, powerful people who have been doing this for centuries. You read all about this in the Old Testament and the kings that rise up and ultimately are corrupted by power. And so they developed this sort of worldview that's like everybody's out for everybody. If I don't take advantage of this person to move up in the world, then they're going to take advantage of me. So it's a dog-eat-dog world, right? I'm going to do what I have to do, even if I hurt people along the way. That was his understanding of the world. And yet, even with that, John comes in, preaches with conviction, preaches with authority, preaches as one who's able to live out what he actually believes, so much so that his identity is rooted in who he's called to be, which is the one to point the way to Jesus. And so he's not afraid to call out Herod. He's not afraid of Herod. He's not afraid of death. He's able to speak to him with conviction. In Herod's worldview, if it were true, John the Baptist shouldn't exist. But the reality is he does. And it totally shakes him to his core. Because I bet you Herod's looking at John thinking, what's his motive? Like, what's his angle? What's he trying to get out of this? And you learn in the end that his only motive was one that would bring him to his death. And that was to point people to Jesus. And so with that, I think that Herod's foundational beliefs, his worldview, was confronted by John. The third thing that I think is super important is that doubt actually provides a window of opportunity. You have to allow it to examine the foundations of your life, and with that leads you to a decision point, to a moment where Herod is looking at his life and there is an opportunity for him to act and to change. He's faced with that option. In verse 21, it's so deeply ironic. What does it say? When the opportune time came for who? Herodias. She saw the banquet and she said, "This is my chance." And the terrible irony is that when Herodias' window of opportunity opened and she said, "Yes, I'm going to take this chance," I think Herod's opportunity closed. His window was closed, and it wasn't just closed for that moment. I think it was closed forever. She acted decisively when he didn't make a decision because he wouldn't. And when it closed, it was closed forever. And if you read verses 14, 15, and 16, this is before all this happens. You see not long after John the Baptist was killed that Herod's conscience is like chasing after him. He hears about Jesus Christ and he's intrigued because he sounds a lot like John the Baptist. And it said, it might be John the Baptist back from the dead. It's like he's being haunted by John's ghost at this point. And he's fascinated by Jesus. But we learn as we keep reading in Mark that doesn't last very long. At the end of the Gospels, when Jesus goes before Herod, what does Herod do? He mocks him. He's no longer spiritually curious. That window of curiosity is closed. In a moment that he had to act and to respond to that curiosity, that window ended up being closed the moment John the Baptist was beheaded. I'm reminded of a story that illustrates this in a way. It's actually from J.R. Tolkien's work, The Lord of the Rings. Maybe you've seen the movies or read the books. But in the second book, The Two Towers, there's this really fascinating scene that actually when you read one of Tolkien's biographies, the biographer talked about how this was one of the passages in his book that he could not get through without weeping. That every time Tolkien would read this passage, it would just bring him to tears. And the passage, what happened in the story is in The Two Towers, there's this character Gollum who's kind of having that word doubt that I talked about, the sort of two psyches, two personalities. That's kind of what's going on inside Gollum's mind. And there's this moment when Gollum is trying to kill Sam and Frodo and brings them to this giant spider, which is a really cool scene in the book. But before they go up to the lair of the spider, Sam and Frodo fall asleep. And there's this moment where you get a glimpse into Gollum's humanity. And he walks over to them and he rubs Frodo's leg and he says these words. And for a moment you think, oh, maybe Gollum's actually okay. Maybe he has a chance to turn it around. And it says, and the way that Tolkien would describe that sort of dual personality is Gollum's eyes would turn green whenever he'd get evil. And so all of a sudden Sam wakes up and says, "What are you doing? Like, what are you doing? Were you sneaking off, trying to be evil and all this?" And then Gollum, all of a sudden his eyes go green, and it was like that moment, that chance to change completely closed forever. That moment he had to maybe go a different way was closed forever. And the reason Tolkien found it so painful is he really had real compassion for Gollum's character. But that window of opportunity was closed. Here's what I want you to consider, is that you do not have the power or the control over your heart that you think you have. Right? The heart is a fickle thing. In fact, the scriptures talk about the human heart being a wicked and deceitful thing, and we can't trust our own heart. And so when we have a window of opportunity, when our hearts are softened towards movement, towards a call that God has on our life, man, we have a window of opportunity to say yes to that call. That window of opportunity may not be open forever. And so 10 days from now, 10 months from now, 10 years from now, you're going to be incapable of doing the thing that you know you ought to do because that opportunity, that moment to make the change has passed. And so the doubts, the wrestling, the struggling, all of those things can become a window of opportunity for us to say yes and to step into whatever it is that God's calling us to do. And the reason this story is a tragedy for Herod is that he had this window, this moment of time where things could have been different, but instead that window closed for him. And that window did not reopen. And so I would just ask you a few questions this morning. Is there anything right now that you know in your life needs to change? Something you need to do, something you've been holding off. Maybe there's a grudge that you've been holding on to, a resentment in your heart against someone you love, a loved one, a sibling, a parent, a friend, a colleague that you've been holding on to anger and frustration with and have an inability to forgive that person. If you're holding on to that this morning, I want you to consider about the window of opportunity you have to forgive that person. You know, I heard it said that holding on to resentment is like eating poison but waiting for the other person to die. It's like holding someone hostage when the reality, the only person in prison is yourself. Because that resentment fuels something in us that is incredibly unhealthy. This is why Jesus tells us to forgive, not 7 times, but to forgive 70 times 7. Every single time, because Jesus knows what unforgiveness does to the human heart. Perhaps it's the other direction. It's not a needing to forgive, it's a needing to ask for forgiveness. Maybe you've wronged someone and deep down, you know, what you really need to say to that person is, I'm sorry. But for whatever reason, your pride gets in the way and it just feels like too much to admit that maybe you were in the wrong. But there is power in those words that I'm sorry. Can I have your forgiveness? No, I'm sorry, but, right? But I'm sorry, and leaving it there. Maybe it's something else. Maybe it's an addiction that's in the dark that if you brought light to it is scary because it would force you to have to confront things that maybe you don't want to confront. It's the hiddenness. It's the things that you know deep down. And if you don't change, if something doesn't happen, if there isn't some inciting incident that forces you to deal with it, that it could ultimately lead to something far worse. That vertigo, right? That sort of tension. If you're experiencing that, it could be a window of opportunity to act. It could save your life. It could save your marriage. It could save your family. And so consider that. And consider it carefully. I think this story is a story about doing what we're afraid to do. I think Herod was afraid to act. He was afraid to believe the things that were being said, but there was something so compelling about it that he could not let it go. And so in closing, you may ask yourself, well, how will I have the power to do the thing that is hard to do? And so I want to leave you with this idea. I think the big thing is that we need to recognize our fear. We need to recognize our fear. And I think what happened was that Herodias knew Herod's greatest fear, but I don't think Herod was self-aware enough to know it himself. Because the reality is, whether religious or not, all of us have an identity that we sort of build for ourselves. We build our self-worth on it, our significance, our self-esteem, our hope gets put on something. It can be power, approval, your career, success, your fame, your wealth, individual person's love for you, your family, your security, your intellect, whatever it might be. The causes that you're involved with, like there are so many things we can put our hope on. But whatever the central thing that is sort of dictating our emotional life, that thing, if we can identify it, we can begin to see maybe there's something that we fear losing. And here's what happened. Herodias knew that because Herod was starting to feel these things towards John the Baptist, he knew that what he really feared the most was the loss of face before powerful men. And so when she brought that little scheming thing towards her daughter to bring to him, he knew that he didn't have a choice. I'm sure he didn't want to do it. He loved John. There was something about John that was so compelling, but he did it anyway because she knew his biggest fear and she prayed on it, that he did not want to lose face in front of power. And so I would ask you to think about, what are the ways and things that tend to be elevated above your love for Jesus Christ? What are the things that move to the place of idolatry in your life? Think about, what are the things that if you were to lose it would be your ultimate fear? I think when we can identify that, we can have the self-awareness to know, yeah, I struggle with these things, then I think we have a clue to what's underneath that, and we can really submit and surrender the things we need to surrender to God so that he can do a healing work in us. At the end of the day, Herod was fascinated with John, and there was a window of opportunity for him. Look at this man in this kingdom, the only one who had the guts to look me in the eye and tell me the truth. And yet, because he didn't act on that window of opportunity, that window closed for him. And here's the thing about it. I really think the other piece that maybe we miss is that Herod wasn't actually listening to John's teachings. Because if you know anything about John, all of his teaching were, I'm not the guy. I'm the guy who's here to tell you about the guy who's coming. He was always pointing to Jesus. And I think Herod just somehow had this blindness to him and could not see the truth in what he was teaching. And I think John's quote says it best, right? What does John say? He says, I must decrease so that he will increase. And if Herod understood that, it would have changed his life. And so let me close by just saying, you are not saved by the purity and quality of your faith. You are saved by Jesus Christ alone. So don't put your faith in yourself. Put your faith in the one who is sufficient for your salvation, and that is Jesus. And if you are in that experience, almost the same way that Jesus experienced doubt on the cross when he's about to pass and he yells, my God, why have you forsaken me? That moment of disorientation, that moment of the double mind seeping in and all of a sudden submitting to the will of the Father. He experienced that death so that ultimately we don't have to just get our act together. We just have to grab the branch. Jesus is the branch, and he's strong enough to hold you. So put your faith in him. Grab the branch. Will you pray with me? Lord, help us to really get that, because the temptation for us is to allow doubt to creep into a way that leads us to sort of oblivion and questioning the reality and assurance of our salvation. But would you remind us again and again that it is not about the quality or purity of our perfect faith that saves us, but it is by your perfect obedience in Jesus that we can have salvation. May we get that not just in our mind, but in our hearts. May we be honest about the things that we perhaps fear and struggle with. And may we lay them at your feet so that you could do a transforming work in us, drawing us to be more in your likeness. And so I pray for those who have that window of opportunity. May they not let that window pass them by, but may they act and say, Lord, I don't know what you're doing in me, but you're doing something, and I don't want to let this opportunity pass me by. Would you say yes to the invitation that God has for you? What he's inviting you into, which is freedom, the freedom that only the gospel can give. May we receive this invitation. It's for your beautiful name that we pray. Amen.